Okay, so I was asked to talk about engaging the public in decision-making. The first thing I'm going to do is just mention that I'm actually interested in food security rather than ecology, and developing transdisciplinary methods, although I myself am a psychologist, to try and improve food security. So we work with many of the methods that have been described today, systematic review, meta-analysis, Delphi methodology, and very quantitative approaches, Bayesian network analysis, and also working with consumers. There are a range of ways to engage the public. I'm going to focus on public engagement. Now, I've had a long journey, I suppose, with public engagement. Initially, when the use of public engagement in decision-making was first mooted, I was very optimistic about the impacts that this would have on science policy and food security. Subsequently, I got pessimistic, then I would say probably academically depressed about the use of public engagement. And subsequently, I guess, I've become cautiously optimistic, and I'll explain why. So this is a governance model resulting from a project called Safe Foods, funded by the European Commission. It ended quite a while ago in 2010. I'm not putting this up as a model which is particularly innovative in terms of food safety risk analysis, but I just want to pull out a couple of components of the model. The first, that it's a cyclical process. The problem is framed, risk and benefit assessment are included in the analysis of different food safety issues, including those related to the impacts on the environment, but also the social and economic worlds. These are evaluated, reviewed, and used to reframe problems. But right at the heart of the model is the concept of public participation. And that was important in 2010 because there was general recognition in policy circles that the public didn't trust their decision-making anymore. After GM foods, BSE, foot and mouth, the introduction of other new food technologies, there was an enormous amount of concern, and there was empirical evidence to support this, that the public didn't trust policymakers anymore. And if they weren't trusted, then why should they take the policies seriously and accept that was the way forward? So public participation was seen as a kind of panacea to all of this. If we involve the public with decision-making, then that's going to have a very positive effect on the way the public accept decisions. So let's go right back to the beginning of this century. And part of the research I was conducting then with my colleague Jean Rowe involved looking at different mechanisms for engaging the public in policy, particularly food policy, but not exclusively food policy. And so we started to map out and develop typologies through systematic review of these different methods. Now, I think this is what I was asked to talk about, but like a previous speaker, I'm not going to, because I don't think that would make a really exciting talk. There are various methods available, varying from the very quantitative, huge surveys, through to much more qualitative, small participatory groups, which are very much more reflective and discussive. We also developed criteria for evaluating public participation. The first set of criteria reflect acceptance or fairness. These include representativeness, independence, early involvement, transparency, and influence. So these all look rather intuitively good in terms of acceptance and fairness. The second set of criteria related to process or competence. So task definition, the nature of the scope of the task should be clearly defined. There should be adequate resources to conduct a public engagement task, and it should be structured. These are fine, these are very good. How do they work in practice? So I'm going to go back to the issue of genetically modified foods in Europe, which triggered an enormous amount of public engagement. There was a lot of societal pressure for public participation in the UK following the GM debate. So the first was the coming of an end of the de facto moratorium on GM crop cultivation. It was then the Tony Blair government's administration's modernising government programme, which took very kindly to some of the issues about engaging the public, developing trust. So there was a preoccupation with government about loss of public trust, a major review of the regulatory framework for biotechnology, the establishment of now defunct councils to oversee agricultural and environmental biotechnology, the House of Lords report on science and society, and the impact of BSE and the Phillips report. So the government funded various public participation exercises, some focus groups, and this was back in the first decade of this century. 8 with ordinary citizens, pre-selected to represent a spread of socio-demographic characteristics, and 1 with GM stakeholders. Exploratory framing of issues in preparation for the main debate process the following summer. There were various open meetings, major national meetings organised by the Steering Board Executive, meetings organised by local councils or national organisations, and a third tier of local meetings organised by community groups. This was followed up by some additional focus groups, again, held with ordinary citizens, pre-selected to be representative in some broad context, and they met twice to deliberate on GM issues. To ensure representativeness, there was a much broader national quota sample of 1,363 people, as well as a survey of all of those people involved in public engagement. So I'm just putting up this slide to look at the distribution of responses to the survey. So if we look at the bigger sample there, which was nationally distributed, you can see that the relationship between perceived risks and perceived benefits was kind of more or less centralized. So people were fairly normally distributed. If we look at the responses to the people involved in the public engagement exercises, you can see that there was a much more of a skew towards perceived risks. What happened was that these data were subsequently used to argue that the results of the public participation exercises, which kind of supported the idea of a continued moratorium, could be discounted because they were not representative of the general population. So if I just come back to that slide, I'm not sure that that's right. So, for example, we've done some research looking at attitudes towards nanotechnology in the area of food production. And what we found there was that actually, if you take a nationally representative sample, in this case of Dutch participants, around 1,000, and give them information about the risks and benefits of nanotechnology, what actually happens is that a very small percentage shift to greater perception of risk, a small percentage to greater perception of benefit. Most people become more convinced that they don't have an opinion. They're ambivalent. So one of the reasons I got a little bit disgruntled, I suppose, with the idea of public participation was the assumption that all members of the public will want to engage in every policy that's being developed, whether that's in conservation or food security or the location of nuclear generators or power stations, because actually people can't do that. They're going to be very keen on a few issues and wish to articulate and express their opinions, but not everybody is going to be interested in all of the issues. And the reason these people here turned up for the public engagement events associated with GM is what they were actually interested in the issue. And these people are actually paid to complete a survey, but they may not be engaged in the policy issue under consideration. And so my question is, well, if they're actually ambivalent, do they really care about the policy that's being enacted? So I think that's one thing we need to think about. So the whole exercise, I think, cost about £2 million in total. Not hugely expensive, but not cheap. The level of impact on the wider public was uncertain. One of the goals was to make the public aware of the GM policy issue, and most people hadn't heard of GM or this exercise after it had been conducted when compared to before. But the other issue was that whatever the outcome, European policies were already being enacted. So why engage the public at a cost of £2 million, perhaps alienate those people who have been involved in the public engagement exercise and spent a lot of time airing their views, saying what they thought, when in fact European policy, national policy had moved on. So whatever the outcome, it's not going to make a difference. So there was considerable cynicism among both participants and the wider public about the likely impact of the debate on government policy. So some conclusions. The conclusions of the GM Nation report were that actually public participation is a bit flawed, because the people that turned up for the event were more negative than the national population, and actually the government preferred the views of the national population. Against this, of course, people who are interested are more likely to participate, whether that's positive or negative. So many of these meetings become polarized. At the end, how do you take into account a spectrum of opinion in policy? I think most important is that the results didn't align with government policies, so they were therefore discounted. And I would say that public participation needs to be conducted and independently evaluated. Again, systematic review has shown that this very, very rarely happens. So quite often, a public participation exercise will be held, but the results will not be formally evaluated and the impact on policies described, or even the reasons why the outcomes were not used, described. Okay, I really don't want to go through this in detail. I'd like to pull up this point here. Because I work with both very large samples of survey data and meta-analysis, and very small samples, maybe 8 people in a room in a focus group or using one of these other methods, I'm sometimes quite challenged by this idea of quantification. So if we're thinking about engaging the public, is it better to take an average view from a very large sample of people? Or is it better to be understanding how, I suppose, small groups of people interact and come up with an idea? And make recommendations from policy. I'd also challenge the idea that perhaps sometimes it's that left of field idea which is the one that moves policy on. So here's the results from a European project that's just finished. The idea of the GMO Presto project was to develop really the risk assessment guidelines for a potential new era net in Europe looking at GMO risk assessment. So these are the results, the headlines from a European-wide Delphi study, which also included participants from the US and Australia, about what needs to be included in future research agendas about GMO impact assessment. As you can see, it's not very different to that governance diagram I put up in the first place, the model of governance. People are still asking for risk and benefit assessment, effective public engagement, effective knowledge exchange and co-design of governance processes, and a full understanding of the impacts on health, the environment, socioeconomic impacts, and ethical considerations. As of yesterday, we don't know if this era net is going ahead. If it does, then I suspect some of these issues will be addressed. What I'm concerned about is that we don't seem to be moving on in using this data in an effective way in decision making. So there's a big issue about identifying appropriate methods to consult the public. I think we need to combine the very large quantitative assessments with much more, I suppose, qualitative approaches where we're investigating people's priorities and preferences, perhaps looking at the outcome of those quantitative studies and trying to understand what's driving people's thoughts and priorities. So I've been working quite closely with some anthropologists in another European project called Pararas. Again, not really looking at conservation, but looking at domestic violence, governance associated with Romani populations in Eastern Europe, and nanotechnology and food. And this was trying to focus on how the outputs of public engagement get into European policy agendas. And one of the conclusions of this research, and this was published in 2015, so it's not old research, is that there's a pretty systemic failure of public engagement to achieve policy impacts. Steve, being an anthropologist, he likes lurking, so he lurked around the European Commission and interviewed all sorts of policy people there and came up with some conclusions that basically suggest that there are various features of a public engagement mechanism which need to relate to features of policy-making institutions and policy-making processes. And there's a big mismatch between people doing the public engagement and the way institutions work. The other major conclusion that he came to was that a lot of the influence is done informally, that it's done through people working with public engagements in informal spaces, the in-between spaces, that actually there are very few institutional spaces here where this information is formally incorporated, but it depends on the interrelationship between individual policymakers and those doing the PE research. And once that individual with an interest in public engagement moves on to another job, as policymakers often do, that's a requirement in Europe that you move on after 5 years to a new position, then the person interested in research into public engagement has to renegotiate contact with individual policymakers. So basically, there are in-between spaces where this information is delivered to end users. That the main barriers to the use of public participation in evidence may lie within policy processes themselves, that there are a few spaces where this can be formally taken up, and that perhaps political institutions in themselves have the responsibility to establish formalized procedures for monitoring the uptake and use of evidence from public participation in their decision-making processes. And if we come back to GM Nation, I don't think it's acceptable to say that the results don't align with policy, because why engage with the public if that's the conclusion you've already reached? There's a few notes on features of public engagement which are required to facilitate uptake. I won't go through them all, except this second bullet point here, which is that a lot of this is about building relationship. It's not enough to just stand up at the front of a room and say, these are my results, what are you going to do with these? And another systematic review conducted recently demonstrated that there's an almost total lack of transparent procedures, for example, during policy impact assessment, for tracking the use of public engagement-derived evidence in decision-making. I'm not saying that it's put in a cupboard and locked and that's it. But in some way, there needs to be a mechanism for assessing impact or lack of impact. Now, we've heard how we're all under stress from the REF to make sure that our research is used in some formal way. We're all running around trying to find this evidence, but to be honest, the mechanisms for assessing impact are simply not there. I've been told to stop, which is good, because this is my last slide. The public are engaged in various ways. There are different approaches to engaging them, but a lot of the routes to impact are currently informal. Should we formalize this? Or perhaps making them too formal will be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. In my defence, I am a Magpie supporter, so I can say I think it's clever scheduling to put a Professor of Food and Society just before lunch. Because we are slightly late for lunch now, we'll take one question if there is one. Down at the front here. Karen?
Hi, Clive Mitchell from Scottish Natural Heritage. That's a fascinating talk with so many questions, and I think parallels, important ones with nature conservation and public engagement around that. I was kind of surprised in a way you didn't refer in any way to power relations, and I just wondered to what extent you think that they have coloured both the structure and the process of participatory engagement and the way that that has played out amongst the other power interests in GM or any other issues that might be at play.
Okay, I think implicitly in the GM Nation outcome, those power relationships were overwhelming in terms of how the information was used. There's a big literature on how power operates in discussion groups, in participatory processes, and how information is taken up into decision-making. I agree it's enormously important. What to do about it, I'm less sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.